When we talk about history's great conquerors,
Mm.
we typically expect this really simple, almost comic book narrative.
Oh, yeah. Like the bad guys on horses sweep in, right?
Exactly. They sweep in, they burn everything to the ground, and the historian just kind of points at the ashes and says, well, they're the barbarians.
Right. The ultimate villains.
Yeah, but today, you and I are going to shatter that illusion entirely. So welcome to the deep dive. It is Wednesday, April 15th, 2026, and whether you are prepping for a class or commuting or just, intensely curious, we are so thrilled you, the learner, are joining us today.
It's going to be a fascinating one for sure.
It really is. We have this massive encyclopedic source document sitting right in front of us covering the complete history of the Mongol Empire. And our mission today is to uncover an absolute paradox.
The ultimate paradox, really.
Yeah, we are looking at how a fractured, desperate nomadic people built the largest contiguous empire in human history. And in doing so, they violently dragged the modern, interconnected world into existence.
It is the definition of historical muddy waters, honestly.
Right.
We let our history easily categorized into, creators and destroyers.
Right, good guys and bad guys.
Exactly. But what we are talking about today isn't just a series of bloody battles. I mean, it is a complete structural rewiring of the globe. To ground you in the sheer mind-boggling scale of what we are dealing with here at its height, this empire stretched from the Sea of Japan all the way to Eastern Europe.
Which is it's hard to even wrap your head around that map.
It's massive. It connected the Pacific Ocean to the Mediterranean Sea in a way that had literally never been seen before. What's fascinating here is that this wasn't just conquest. It was the radical, forced integration of Eurasia.
Okay, let's unpack this. Because to really understand how this happened, you have to wipe away any preconceived images of grand palaces or, massive treasuries or established nations.
Yeah, forget all the standard medieval tropes.
Right. I want you to imagine the harsh, unforgiving steppes of 12th century East Asia, specifically the Mongolian plateau. We are talking about a place where the wind just cuts right through you.
Oh, absolutely brutal conditions.
Where temperatures plummet well below zero and where simple survival was a daily, brutal battle.
Keep that image in your head because the mid-12th century Mongolian steppe was a highly volatile, completely fragmented environment. There was no single Mongol nation.
It wasn't unified at all.
Not even close. Instead, you had competing tribal confederations. So you had the Mongols, the Tatars, the Naimans, the Merkits, the Karaite.
Right.
And they were locked in this endless grinding cycle of raiding, kidnapping, and warfare over incredibly scarce resources. Poverty was rampant.
And didn't the Chinese dynasties actively play a role in that?
Big time. To make matters worse, they were constantly being manipulated by the Chinese Jin dynasty to the south. The Jin actively funded different factions to keep the nomads weak and divided, so it was basically a pressure cooker of trauma and scarcity.
Wow. So into this chaotic, freezing meat grinder of a world, a boy named Temujin is born around 1162.
Who we all eventually know as Genghis Khan.
Exactly. But his early life is, it's the farthest thing from royalty. It is pure, unadulterated trauma. His father, Yasuge, had some minor success leading the Mongol tribe, but when Temujin is just a child, his father is poisoned by rival Tatars.
Yeah, at a feast, which was a huge violation of hospitality.
Right, at a feast. And the immediate aftermath is staggering. The tribe doesn't rally around the young heir like you'd see in the movies. They abandon his family on the steppe to die.
Right, let's look at the mechanics of why that happens, because it sounds incredibly cruel to us.
It sounds sociopathic.
It does, but in a zero-sum environment where winter means actual starvation, a widow with young children is considered dead weight. The tribe calculates that they literally cannot afford the calories to keep them alive.
So it's pure, brutal math.
Exactly. So Temujin's mother, Holun, and her children are cast out. They are forced to survive by foraging, eating roots, marmots, whatever small game they can catch in one of the harshest climates on Earth.
Wait, let me stop you there because the psychological impact of that has to be immense. You are thrown away by your own people. You learn immediately that the social contract is a complete lie.
Precisely. And that environment breeds a terrifying, ruthless pragmatism in young Temujin. And we see this explicitly when he is just a teenager.
Yeah, the story with his brother.
Right. To secure his position as the undisputed head of this tiny outcast family unit, he and his full brother ambush and murder his older half-brother. And it's over a dispute about a stolen fish and a bird.
Which is just staggering to think about. He is learning that power is absolute and violence is the only way to secure it. But the trauma loop doesn't close there, does it?
No, it just keeps going.
Because later, his newlywed wife, Berta, is kidnapped by the Merkits. And the sources point out this wasn't just random violence, right?
No, it was delayed retaliation.
Right, because Temujin's father had abducted his mother, Hulun, from the Merkits years prior. It's this endless generational cycle of blood feuds.
Yet this kidnapping is really the catalyst that changes history, because Temujin doesn't just accept the loss. He realizes that to survive, let alone rescue his wife, he needs leverage.
He needs allies.
Exactly. He is a masterful geopolitical operator, even at a young age. So he goes to his father's old ally, Tokrul, the Khan of the Kerit, and he reaches out to his own childhood blood brother, this young rising leader named Jamuka.
Right.
Together, they form a massive coalition, crush the Merkits, and rescue Berti. But the rescue is just, the match striking the flint.
Right, it kicks off a massive chain reaction.
Yeah, what follows is a long, bloody, decades-long rise to power, where he systematically outmaneuvers and eliminates every single rival on the steppe. The Tatars, the Naimans, and eventually he fights a devastating civil war against his old friend Jamuka.
By 1205, he has essentially eradicated or subjugated everyone. And this culminates in the year 1206 at a massive assembly called a Kurultai, right?
Yes, the 1206 Kurultai.
Where a shaman named Teb Tengiri formally proclaims him Genghis Khan, the universal ruler of the great Mongol nation. Now, I have to push back a little on the way this is sometimes framed in pop history.
Oh, the romanticized version?
Yeah. When you read this narrative, it's so tempting to view it as a classic hero's journey. The impoverished outcast boy who pulls himself up by his bootstraps to become the king.
Right, like a movie script.
But reading the actual sources, it feels much more like a ruthless mafia consolidation. Temujin wasn't just fighting enemy armies, he was fighting the very concept of tribal loyalty, and he systematically dismantled it.
I'd argue it's even more calculated than a mafia consolidation, honestly. I mean, the steppe was a landscape where betrayal was just common sense.
Wow.
Yeah. Temujin's early experiences being abandoned, surviving assassination, navigating these endless betrayals, it forged a worldview where traditional noble birth meant absolutely nothing. Loyalty to him was the only currency that kept you alive.
So bloodline didn't matter anymore.
Not at all. If you were loyal, you were elevated regardless of your bloodline. If you betrayed him, your entire lineage could be erased. He didn't just unite the existing tribes, he ground them down to dust and rebuilt a completely new society in his own image.
Which is the perfect pivot point, because conquering a harsh patch of grass and uniting a bunch of traumatized survivors is one thing. But conquering the known world requires an entirely different kind of machinery.
A total paradigm shift.
Right. So how did Genghis Khan take this fractured population and engineer them into an unstoppable military-industrial complex?
He did it through a total top-down social revolution. Once he took absolute power, he abolished the old tribal structures entirely. He introduced a strict decimal system.
Okay, break that down for us.
So the entire society and military were restructured into units of 10, called arbans. 10 of those made a zun of 100. 10 of those made a minion of 1,000, and 10 of those formed a tumen of 10,000 soldiers.
But let's explain why that matters to you, the listener. Because it wasn't just a spreadsheet exercise, right? It wasn't just about accounting.
Oh, exactly the opposite. It was psychological reprogramming. He took men from different, formerly warring tribesmen whose fathers might have actually killed each other and forced them into the same 10-man tents.
That is wild.
You lived together, you cooked together, you fought together. And the enforcement mechanism was collective punishment.
Oh, right. The sources talk about this.
Yeah, if one man in your arban ran from battle, the entire 10-man squad was executed.
Wow.
If an entire arban ran, the zun of 100 was executed. It forcibly erased old tribal identities because your survival now depended entirely on the 9 guys standing next to you, completely regardless of who their grandfathers were.
Here's where it gets really interesting. This system created a pure, unadulterated meritocracy. The sources mention he promoted low-born followers, like literally shepherds and blacksmiths, to command these massive tumens of 10,000 men.
Giving them way more authority than his own blood relatives.
Exactly. Now, I want you to imagine the psychological shock to the global world order. You are a highly trained, noble-born, aristocratic general in China or Eastern Europe. You have a massive, impossibly expensive army.
Right, knights in shining armor.
Right, and you are utterly outmaneuvered and annihilated by a force commanded by a guy who 20 years ago was literally eating marmots on the freezing steppe. The shock must have been paralyzing.
It completely broke the paradigm of medieval warfare. And alongside this military restructuring, he implemented a legal code called the Yassa.
The Yassa. Yeah.
And it wasn't just military law, it was total social control. It banned the selling of women, outlawed theft, completely forbade fighting among Mongols, and even regulated hunting to protect animal breeding seasons.
Wait, really? Hunting regulations?
Yeah, he created a highly disciplined, completely mobilized society where every single person was a cog in the war machine. Even the economy was geared toward it.
Let's talk about the physical edge this machine had, because we're talking about warriors who essentially lived in the saddle. The sources point out that each Mongol warrior traveled with a string of multiple horses, sometimes 5 or 6, right?
Exactly. If one horse got tired, they didn't stop to rest. They just hopped onto a fresh one mid-gallop.
And that logistical independence is crucial. I mean, European and Chinese armies relied on these massive, slow-moving supply trains, carts full of grain, herds of livestock. If you cut their supply lines, they starved and surrendered.
But the Mongols were their own supply line.
Exactly. They carried dried meat and milk curd. And if they were crossing a desert and starving, they would open a small vein in their horse's neck, drink a small amount of blood, patch it up, and keep riding.
It's incredible endurance. And they wore light silk armor under leather, which could trap arrows without penetrating deep tissue, allowing for extreme mobility.
And they weren't stubbornly proud either. That's a huge point the sources make. If they encountered a problem they couldn't solve with horses and arrows, like, say, a massive walled city, they adapted immediately.
They absorbed the talent of the people they conquered.
Right. They captured Chinese siege engineers and forced them to build trebuchets and catapults. They effectively crowdsourced global military technology.
That adaptability was honed through something called the Nurj, which was the traditional Mongol hunt. But we need to be clear, this wasn't a recreational, aristocratic fox hunt.
Right, it wasn't for sport.
It was a grueling, large-scale military drill. Thousands of men would spread out over dozens, sometimes hundreds of miles, forming a massive circle.
Wow.
Over weeks, they would slowly close in, maintaining perfect spacing, driving all the wild animals into a central trap where they would be slaughtered.
And the stakes were literally life and death. If a single animal slipped through the line because a soldier lost focus, that soldier was severely punished, sometimes executed.
Yes, and that hyper-coordinated discipline translated directly to the battlefield.
Yeah.
They could execute massive, perfectly timed encirclements of enemy armies across vast distances entirely without modern communication.
Which is mind-blowing.
They communicated via flags, whistling arrows, and smoke.
Think about that for a second. If you look at modern special forces or even massive multinational corporations today, they still use this exact matrix. You have decentralized, highly agile squads, like those units of 10, that can operate entirely independently in the field, but feed into a larger, unified command structure for ultimate flexibility.
Yeah, that's a great comparison.
Genghis Khan was basically running a 13th century agile startup that just happened to be in the business of global conquest.
The efficiency of it is terrifying. This perfectly tuned machine was initially pointed at northern China, taking on the Jin dynasty and the western Jia. They were systematically dismantling the established powers of Asia. But then, in 1227, the founder dies.
Right.
Genghis Khan passes away, and his body is taken back to the steppe for a secret burial.
And that burial site has never been found.
A burial site, by the way, that remains undiscovered to this day because, according to legend, the funeral escort killed anyone they encountered on the road to keep it a secret, and then a river was literally diverted over the grave.
Wow. So the founder is gone. The machine needs a new driver. And the operating system of the empire dictates that it is essentially the joint property of the imperial family.
Right, it wasn't just handed to one guy automatically.
The new driver chosen is Genghis's third son, Ögedei. Now, the sources describe him as charismatic, maybe a bit of a heavy drinker, but incredibly ambitious. And Ögedei is the one who pushes the empire to its absolute terrifying limits.
It really does.
He initiates a staggering two-front war. On one side, he is finishing off the Jin dynasty in central China. On the other side, he launches a massive push west into Kievan Rus, what is now Russia and Ukraine, and right into the heart of Europe.
The logistics of coordinating a multi-front war across a continent in the 13th century are almost beyond comprehension. You have Mongol armies operating thousands of miles apart.
Yeah, completely different terrains.
Right. In the east, they are navigating the dense populations, massive rivers, and walled cities of China. In the west, under the command of Genghis's grandson Batu Khan and the brilliant general Subutai, They are just rolling over the Russian principalities like a tidal wave.
And the destruction is apocalyptic. We're not talking about conquering and taxing. We're talking about obliteration. They hit the city of Ryazan, lay siege to it for a few days, and when the walls fall, they massacre the inhabitants so thoroughly that the city essentially ceases to exist. They just roll over the capital of Kievan Rus.
And they do it by turning the environment against their enemies.
Yes, the winter tactics.
Exactly. European armies generally hunkered down during the brutal Russian winters. The cold was considered an impenetrable shield. But the Mongols actually preferred winter campaigns.
That's so counterintuitive.
But they used the frozen rivers as literal paved highways for their horses. They could strike deep into enemy territory at lightning speed when the local lords thought they were perfectly safe.
It's just brilliant, terrifying asymmetrical warfare. And it wasn't just brute force either. It was deeply data-driven. The sources really highlight their rigorous intelligence gathering.
Oh, their spy networks were legendary.
Before a Mongol army ever fired a single arrow, their spies and merchants had spent years mapping the political divisions of their enemies, the geography, the troop numbers. They knew exactly which European prince hated which duke, and they expertly exploited those fractures.
Absolutely. So, by 1241, this Western force pushes past the smoking ruins of Rus and enters Central Europe. The European powers try to mount a defense, but the Mongols simultaneously annihilate the Polish, Moravian, and Hospitaller armies at the Battle of Lenica, and just days later, they utterly crush the Hungarian army at the Sajo River.
It wasn't even close.
No. The Knights Templar, the Teutonic Knights, the elite, heavily armored military orders of Europe were completely dismantled by light cavalry.
They have Europe by the throat. Batu's forces are poised to march on Vienna, sweeping into northern Albania. There is essentially no standing army left between them and the Atlantic Ocean. The Mongol machine is unstoppable.
Oh.
And then they just stop.
Yeah, it's crazy.
In 1242, they suddenly pack up their camps and retreat back east. It is one of the most jarring moments in history. But let's avoid the cliche of saying they just, changed their minds.
Right, they didn't just get bored.
It was more like a biological reflex. I think of it like if you touch a hot stove, your hand pulls back before your brain even processes the heat. In 1241, the brain of the Empire Ögedei Khan died thousands of miles away in Asia, and the limbs of the empire instinctively contracted back to the core.
That is the exact mechanism at play. Now, researchers today debate if Ögedei's death was the sole trigger.
Oh, really? What else do they think it could be?
Well, there's compelling evidence of climatic factors, like a sudden wet spring that turned the Hungarian plains into a muddy swamp, which would have starved their horses of pasture.
Oh, that makes sense.
There's also the argument that they were struggling to permanently hold European stone castles. But the overriding factor in the sources was customary Mongol political law. Upon the death of the Great Khan, all princes of Genghis's line were required to immediately return to the homeland to attend the Kurultai to elect a successor.
Which brings up a fascinating what-if scenario for you to ponder. Did Western Europe survive and eventually go on to colonize the globe because of its superior stone fortifications? Or did it survive purely because of a political technicality thousands of miles away in a felt tent in Mongolia?
The geopolitical implications of that are just staggering to think about. But that political technicality also reveals the fatal flaw in the Mongol operating system. They had built an empire that was expanding far faster than its tribal political structure could handle.
Exactly, because that mandated retreat to elect a new Khan, it does not go smoothly.
Yeah.
The empire slams on the brakes and falls into a massive period of stagnation and, frankly, boardroom brawling.
Total gridlock.
Yeah. With Ögedei dead, his widow, Torjin Khatun, takes over as regent. And she is incredibly cunning. She doesn't call the election immediately. She stalls it for over 4 years, meticulously building alliances, replacing state officials, doing everything in her power to ensure her own son, Guk, gets the throne.
And this is where the sheer geography of the empire begins to tear it apart. Batu Khan, who is ruling the newly conquered Western territories, what we eventually call the Golden Horde, flat out refuses to come back for the election.
He just won't show up.
Right. He claims he's suffering from an illness and that the steppe climate is too harsh for him to travel.
Which is an incredibly thin veil. Batu hates Guk, and the situation is exactly like a massive, hostile corporate takeover. Think of Batu Khan as the incredibly powerful, entrenched regional CEO of the European division. He has his own army, his own revenue streams, and he simply refuses to dial into the global board meeting.
That's a perfect way to put it.
And because the corporate bylaws explicitly state that every major shareholder must be present to vote. His absence effectively paralyzes the entire global company for half a decade.
It's a massive standoff. Eventually, the pressure mounts and Batu relents just enough to send representatives rather than attending himself. So Guic is finally elected in 1246. But the bad blood is boiling. Guic's reign is short, paranoid, and chaotic.
Really chaotic.
In 1248, he actually marches his army west, ostensibly for the climate, but it is widely suspected he is launching a surprise attack to wipe out Batu.
But the attack never happens because Guic dies en route, mysteriously.
Yeah.
Possibly poisoned, though the sources remain murky on that. And boom, we're right back into another massive succession crisis.
Here we go again.
Batu, feeling empowered, calls a Kurultai in his own territory in the west, which the other royal families refuse to attend because it's not in the sacred homeland. Ultimately, Batu flexes his immense military weight and throws his support behind Möngke, a prince from the Tuluid family line, the descendants of Genghis's youngest son, Tului.
Now, you have to understand the family tree dynamics here. The descendants of Ögedei and Chagatai, the other sons of Genghis, are furious.
They feel robbed.
They feel the throne has been completely stolen from their bloodlines, so they refuse to accept Möngke. They begin quietly planning an armed coup to assassinate him and take back power.
But Möngke is tipped off by one of his falconers, who notices unusual troop movements. And what follows is not a peaceful transition of power. It is a terrifying, sweeping political purge.
Möngke strikes first, and he strikes hard. He initiates massive treason trials across the entire empire. He doesn't just execute the ringleaders.
No, it's a bloodbath.
Estimates suggest anywhere from 77 to 300 major members of the Mongol elite, aristocratic commanders, and government officials are executed. Princes of Genghis's royal line people with the most sacred blood in the empire are wrapped in carpets and trampled by horses to avoid spilling royal blood on the earth, or they are exiled to the furthest fringes of the empire.
So the Tuluid line violently, definitively secures power. If we connect this to the bigger picture, you can see the fundamental tension tearing at the seams. You have a highly localized political mechanism like a campfire vote among tribal elders trying to govern a global superpower that spans from Korea to Poland.
It was literally choking them.
The communication lag alone made it impossible.
Yeah.
But once Möngke violently clears the boardroom and eliminates all opposition, he essentially reboots the machine. And he proves to be a very serious, capable administrator.
Yes, Möngke realizes that you cannot run an empire of this scale on plunder alone. He launches sweeping administrative reforms to stabilize the economy.
What kind of reforms?
He institutes a fixed, predictable poll tax, so merchants and farmers aren't arbitrarily bled dry. He strictly limits how much the nobility can spend on lavish gifts. And most impressively, he orders a massive, empire-wide census.
A census across that much territory?
Yeah, it takes years to complete, systematically counting people, livestock, and orchards from the dense cities of China all the way to Novgorod in the northwest.
Wow. So once he has the ledger balanced and the economy stabilized, Möngke looks at the map. Because the Mongol war machine thrives on momentum, he orders 2 massive new military campaigns that will permanently alter the course of world history. He sends his brother Kublai to conquer the remnants of the Song dynasty in southern China, and he sends his other brother, Hulagu, into the Middle East.
And Hulagu's campaign is one of the most consequential in history. He marches a massive army westward. His first major target is the Nizari Ismailis, a sect of Shiite Muslims operating from supposedly impregnable mountain fortresses in Persia.
Oh, the Assassins.
Yes, famously known in the West as the Assassins. Hulagu systematically reduces their strongholds, effectively wiping them from political relevance. But the Assassins were just a warm-up. His main target is the crown jewel Baghdad.
Let's spend some real time on Baghdad. Because in 1258, Baghdad isn't just a city. It had been the undisputed center of the Islamic world for 500 years. It was the seat of the Abbasid Caliphate, a beacon of science, art, and wealth.
Truly a golden city.
But politically, it was rotting from the inside, suffering from deep internal divisions and weak leadership under the Caliph al-Mustasim.
So Hulagu approaches the city and sends emissaries demanding that the caliph submit to Mongol rule, dismantle his walls, and offer his treasury. It was the standard Mongol ultimatum.
Right?
But the caliph, perhaps believing the myth of his own invincibility or expecting the wider Islamic world to rally to his defense, arrogantly refuses. He essentially tells Hulagu to turn back or face the wrath of God.
Which, to a Mongol commander, is an absolute invitation for annihilation. Hulagu doesn't just attack the city. He engineers its destruction.
Hmm.
He brings up Chinese siege engineers. They build palisades. They construct massive siege engines. They divert rivers to flood the camps of the defending armies. They trap the city in a vice.
The siege lasts for weeks, and when the walls finally give way, the Mongols subject Baghdad to a merciless, horrific sack. And we have to be clear about the psychological warfare here. The Mongol policy was brutally pragmatic.
Right, submit and live, resist and die.
Exactly. If a city submitted without a fight, it was generally spared, taxed, and absorbed. But if a city resisted and forced the Mongols to expend time and blood, it was made a horrific example of to deter any other city from ever getting the same idea. Baghdad was made the ultimate example.
The descriptions from the sources are really haunting. Hundreds of thousands of civilians were massacred. The grand libraries, including the legendary House of Wisdom, were thrown into the Tigris River. It is said the river ran black with the ink of countless priceless manuscripts and then red with the blood of the scholars.
It's devastating.
The caliph himself was captured, and because of the Mongol taboo against spilling royal blood on the earth, he was allegedly rolled up in a carpet and trampled to death by horses. It was a catastrophic trauma for Islamic history, an abrupt end to the Islamic Golden Age.
With Baghdad reduced to ashes, Hulagu has an open, terrifying route into Syria. He moves against the Ayyubids, capturing Aleppo and Damascus. The Christian powers of Europe are watching in terror, while some actually hope the Mongols will crush Islam entirely. The Mongols are poised to sweep down into Egypt and completely eradicate the remaining Islamic powers.
And then?
But then the fatal flaw of the Mongol system strikes again. History repeats itself.
In 1259, while fighting a grueling, miserable campaign in the heat of southern China, Möngke Khan contracts a disease-likely dysentery or cholera and dies.
And instantly, the geopolitical shockwave hits the Middle East. Hulagu receives the news. He knows that back in the homeland, a massive succession crisis is about to explode between his brothers.
He can't miss out on that.
He cannot risk being left out of the power struggle, nor can he risk his army being cut off, so he is forced to pull the vast bulk of his battle-hardened army out of Syria and march back toward the Caucasus.
He leaves behind a tiny skeleton crew, maybe 10,000 to 20,000 men, under his general Kitbuka, just to hold the territory. And because of this specific political contraction, the Mamluks of Egypt, a dynasty of former slave soldiers who are brilliant cavalrymen in their own right, realize the Mongol force is depleted.
They see the opening.
Right. In 1260, they ride out and clash with Kitbuka's forces at the Battle of Ain Jalut in modern-day Israel.
The Mamluks use superior numbers and feigned retreats, which are classic steppe tactics, ironically, to draw the Mongols into a trap and utterly destroy them. Kitbuka is captured and executed. That battle is monumental because it marks the definitive western limit of the Mongol Empire's expansion.
It breaks the spell.
The myth of Mongol invincibility is shattered. They would never again make serious, lasting military advances further into the Middle East.
The irony is just palpable here. The Mamluks fought brilliantly, yes, but that victory at Ain Jalut was only mechanically possible because Möngke ate something bad in China and died. Hulagu had the overwhelming forces to conquer Egypt and potentially push across North Africa, but Mongol political law forced him to leave. Once again, the Mongols' own internal political structure saved their enemies. But this time, the succession crisis doesn't just stall the empire for a few years, it completely, permanently shatters it.
We enter the era of the Great Fracture. Möngke's death sparks a massive, devastating civil war, the Tuluid Civil War. You have two brothers, Kublai and Arik Boka, who both claim the throne, and they both hold rival cruelties to legitimize themselves.
Of course they do.
Arik Boka holds his in the traditional capital, Karakorum, in the Mongolian homeland. Kublai holds his in his own power base in northern China.
And Kublai realizes he doesn't need to defeat his brother in a pitched battle on the steppe. He uses economics. He controls the agricultural wealth of China, so he simply blockades the supply routes leading up into Mongolia. He starves Karakorum. Arik Bok's forces are reduced to literally eating the bark off trees. By 1264, Arik Bok is forced to surrender to his brother.
But the bleeding doesn't stop there. While the brothers are fighting in the east, the cousins are fighting in the west, you have the Burke-Hulagu War.
Oh, this is the religious conflict, right?
Exactly. Burke, who rules the Golden Horde in Russia, had actually converted to Islam. He is deeply, personally furious with his cousin Hulagu over the brutal sack of Baghdad, the murder of the caliph, and the massacre of his fellow Muslims. Add to that deep disputes over the division of war booty in the Caucasus, and the tensions just boil over.
So you have Mongol armies going to war against other Mongol armies. The invincible machine is eating itself.
What's crucial to understand here is the core ideological split causing this fracture. It wasn't just petty jealousy over who got to sit on the throne. It was an existential crisis about what it actually meant to be a Mongol.
That's a great point.
Arik Bok's faction believed the Mongols must remain nomadic warriors of the steppe, keeping their traditional, austere ways to maintain their martial edge. Kublai's faction, however, looked at the vast wealth of the world and believed they needed to evolve. They argued that to govern these massive, ancient civilizations, they had to become sedentary, cosmopolitan administrators.
Let's put ourselves in that mindset. Imagine being a battle-hardened, traditional Monro warrior on the steppe. Your grandfather fought alongside Genghis Khan. He slept in the freezing snow, drank horse blood to survive, and conquered the world.
The old guard.
Yeah. And now you look south and you're watching Kublai Khan build a massive, sprawling, static capital city in Beijing. He's wearing fine Chinese silk instead of leather. He is establishing the Yuan dynasty in 1271 and actively synicizing his image to look exactly like a traditional Chinese emperor to appease his subjects.
Right, trying to legitimize his rule to the Chinese.
To the traditionalists on the steppe, it must have looked like the ultimate betrayal. The conquerors were being conquered by luxury. I have to ask you, was the fracturing of the empire absolutely inevitable the moment they stepped off the grass and into the cities?
It's a profound question of historical mechanics. I mean, you have an empire entirely built on extreme mobility, decentralized warfare, and a highly localized tribal political system. Once you conquer ancient, deeply entrenched sedentary civilizations with massive, complex bureaucracies like China and Persia, you cannot rule them from horseback.
You just can't.
You have to dismount. You have to adopt their methods of taxation, their administration, their language of governance. The administrative needs of the conquered fundamentally change the cultural DNA of the conquerors. By the time Kublai Khan dies in 1294, the idea of a single, unified empire is gone forever.
It permanently divides into 4 sovereign competing states. Let's lay out the map of these 4 khanates, because this sets the stage for the modern world. In the east, you have the Yuan dynasty in China, ruled by Kublai's descendants, fully embracing Chinese administrative systems.
Right.
In the northwest, covering Russia and Eastern Europe, you have the Golden Horde, ruling from the steppe and extracting heavy tribute from the Russian princes. In the mountainous center, Central Asia, you have the Chagatai Khanate, which tries to hold on to traditional nomadic ways the longest. And in the southwest, covering Persia and the Middle East, you have the Ilkhanate, who eventually convert to Islam and adopt Persian culture.
All 4 are entirely distinct now.
Right. They are independent. They have their own foreign policies. They actively fight each other. The single, terrifying Mongol war machine is broken.
However, even as the empire politically shattered into these 4 distinct pieces, the shared Mongol heritage and the overarching legal and logistical frameworks across these khanates sparked an unprecedented era of economic and cultural globalization. Historians often refer to this period as the Pax Mongolica, or the Mongol Peace.
So what does this all mean? Pax Mongolica. If we look at the sources, it means they built a communication and logistics network that is frankly shocking for the 13th century. It was called the Yam mail system.
The Yam was an absolute masterpiece of statecraft. They essentially built the medieval equivalent of the internet across Eurasia. They set up roughly 1,400 postal relay stations across the breadth of the empire, spaced about a day's ride apart.
Let's explain how this worked for you, the listener. Imagine an official messenger carrying urgent military or political news. They're issued an official passport, a heavy metal medallion called a paisa. This wasn't just an ID card. It gave the bearer the absolute authority of the Khan.
Right, nobody messed with the paisa.
The messenger could ride at breakneck speed, cover 25 miles, arrive at a Yam station, flash the paisa, immediately demand a fresh saddled horse, hot food, and keep riding without stopping to rest.
By doing this in relays, information could travel across the empire at 125 miles a day.
Wow.
To put that in perspective, that is significantly faster than the famed Pony Express managed in America over 600 years later. It was a true information superhighway.
And it wasn't just for military dispatches. Because those roads were secure by the absolute terror of Mongol law, it facilitated the greatest flourishing of the Silk Road in human history. The Mongols actively patronized merchants. They despised the traditional Chinese view that merchants were lowly parasites. The Mongols created the Ortok system.
The Ortok was brilliant. It was essentially a state-backed merchant partnership. Mongol elites, including the Khan's own family, provided the massive capital needed to fund trade caravans. The merchants took the physical risk to travel across the continent, and they split the profits. They instituted low, standardized tariffs. They even planted trees along the roads to provide shade and mark the route in winter snows.
It's like a 13th century Amazon Prime combined with a global venture capital firm. Because of the Mongols, it was actually safe for a single merchant to walk from Italy to China, carrying immense wealth without being robbed by local bandits. That was entirely unthinkable before them. Marco Polo's family were direct beneficiaries of this exact system. And it wasn't just silk, spices, and porcelain moving on these roads, it was ideas.
The scientific and cultural exchange is perhaps the most lasting, profound legacy of the Pax Mongolica. The Mongols were remarkably tolerant of different religions: Buddhism, Islam, Christianity, Taoism exempting clergy from taxes to keep the populations docile and happy, and they had a deep, pragmatic appreciation for mathematics, medicine, and astronomy. They actively moved intellectuals across borders.
They built massive observatories from Karakorum in the east to Tabriz in Persia. You had Chinese astronomers working side by side with Persian mathematicians. They transmitted the astrolabe to Europe. They shared concepts like heliocentrism, which trickled into European thought and later influenced Copernicus. And the sources point out an amazing, hilarious detail. They even facilitated the invention of a primitive form of correction fluid.
Yes. Using a mixture of resin and vegetable pigments, Chinese and Persian scribes developed a way to paint over errors in their massive ledgers.
I love that. You have the great Khans violently conquering the known world, shifting the tectonic plates of global politics, and somewhere in a back room in Tabriz, a scribe is just inventing whiteout because the bureaucracy is getting too complicated.
It's the small things, right?
But this raises an important question, which the sources actively grapple with. Was the Pax Mongolica truly a peace? Or was it just the quiet, terrified compliance of a continent that knew if they stepped out of line, if they robbed a single merchant, a Mongol Tumen would appear and wipe their entire city off the map?
It is the ultimate piece of the sword. It was peace maintained through the threat of absolute, overwhelming violence. But regardless of the bloody motivation, the mechanism of that peace resulted in a massive cross-pollination of goods, technologies, and ideas, like gunpowder and printing, that definitively laid the intellectual groundwork for the European Renaissance.
But the very thing that made them so successful, this incredible hyperconnectivity, these pristine protected superhighways, was about to become their fatal flaw, because those same roads that carried silk, spices, and science were the perfect paved highways for a microscopic killer. Which brings us to the Great Unraveling and the Black Death.
Right. As we move into the mid to late 14th century, the four khanates are already struggling with internal rebellions and economic instability. But the death blow is biological. In 1347, the Golden Horde, under the command of General Janibeg, is laying siege to Kaffa, a major, wealthy Genoese trading port on the Crimean Peninsula.
The Mongols want to control the vital trade routes leading into the Mediterranean, but the Mongol army is bogged down outside the walls, and more importantly, they are withering from a terrifying, mysterious new disease, the bubonic plague.
And this is where we see what is famously cited in historical texts as the first recorded instance of biological warfare. The sources state that Janibeg, watching his army die, orders his troops to load the plague-swollen, infected corpses of their dead soldiers onto their massive catapults, and they launch them over the city walls of Kaffa to infect the inhabitants.
A horrifying image.
The Genoese traders inside the city are absolutely terrified by this grim reign of death. They flee on their ships, sail through the Mediterranean, and carry the plague into the ports of southern Europe. And the result is the Black Death, a pandemic that kills anywhere from 75 to 200 million people globally.
Now, hold on. I have to push back heavily on the Siege of Kaffa narrative. The catapulted corpses make for an incredibly grim, highly cinematic story. It sounds like something out of a movie.
It really does.
But biologically speaking, the plague is primarily spread by fleas living on black rats. Even if the Mongols hadn't launched a single human body over those walls, the rats scurrying around the Mongol siege camps were almost certainly going to find their way through the city walls and onto those Genoese ships anyway. The gruesome catapult tactics might have caused panic, but the hyperconnectivity of the Mongol trade routes meant Europe's exposure was virtually inevitable, regardless of intent.
That's a very crucial distinction. The vector of transmission was the trade network itself, not necessarily the catapults. The Mongols essentially built a global biological circuit, and the plague rode it from east to west. And the massive population loss from the plague is what finally severs the commercial ties that kept the fragmented khanates economically stable.
You can't have global trade if everyone is dead.
Exactly. You can't have global trade if half the merchants and consumers are dead. The economies just collapse under the weight of the mortality rate.
Let's talk about how that played out regionally.
Sure. In China, the Yuan dynasty falls into a devastating hyperinflationary spiral because their paper currency, which they forced everyone to use, loses all backing and trust. Combined with the plague, famine, and harsh ethnic rules, the Han Chinese finally rebel. This massive uprising leads to the establishment of the Ming dynasty, which overthrows the Mongols in 1368 and pushes them all the way back to the freezing steppes where they started.
And the other khanates fall like dominoes in the wake of the plague and economic ruin. The Ilkhanate in Persia falls into a violent political anarchy and completely dissolves. The Chagatai Khanate in Central Asia disintegrates into small warring factions. The Golden Horde slowly breaks into smaller pieces over the next century, eventually losing its grip on Russia. The grand, unified empire is gone.
Which leaves us with the ultimate task of evaluating their legacy, because with the empire dissolved, we have to look at the scars and the structures left behind to understand their true impact on our world. First, we must look at the staggering human cost. The encyclopedic sources estimate that the Mongol conquest resulted in roughly 30 to 80 million deaths.
And to contextualize that, 80 million dead was roughly 11% of the entire global population at the time. I want you to really stop and think about that number. Imagine walking down your street today, going to the grocery store, looking around, and 1 out of every 10 people is just erased.
It's unfathomable.
Entire massive regions were completely depopulated. China's population is estimated to have fallen by half during the Mongol conquest and subsequent plagues. Iran suffered such catastrophic slaughter that some historians estimate it lost up to 75% of its people. Iran didn't recover its pre-Mongol population levels until the mid-20th century.
The sheer scale of the demographic collapse actually altered the global environment. So many millions died, and so much heavily cultivated farmland was suddenly abandoned that the forests grew back.
Wow.
This massive reforestation actually scrubbed enough carbon dioxide from the atmosphere to measurably cool the planet. It is a historical legacy of terrifying extremes.
It's the only time in history a military conquest caused a global cooling event. And alongside that demographic devastation, there is a literal biological legacy running through our veins. Genetic studies suggest that 1 in 200 men worldwide today are direct descendants of Genghis Khan, a testament to the reproductive privileges claimed by the ruling elite.
But geopolitically, their legacy is what drew the borders of the modern map. Take Russia, for example. Before the Mongols arrived, Russia wasn't a unified state. It was a loose, squabbling collection of principalities centered around Kiev.
Right.
But the Golden Horde didn't want to micromanage the deep forests. They wanted tribute. So they used the princes of a small, relatively unimportant trading post called Moscow as their primary tax collectors.
Let me guess. By giving Moscow the authority of the Mongol army to collect taxes from their neighbors, they accidentally built a superpower.
Precisely. By empowering Moscow to enforce Mongol tribute, the Mongols inadvertently consolidated the power, wealth, and military infrastructure of the Grand Duchy of Moscow. Over centuries, Moscow grew so powerful that it eventually threw off the Mongol yoke entirely and evolved into the massive Russian Tsardom. Modern Russia exists in its current centralized form largely because of Mongol tax policy.
And it goes even further. The Mongol Empire directly sparked the European Age of Discovery. Think about Christopher Columbus setting sail across the Atlantic in 1492. He wasn't looking for a new continent. He was specifically trying to find a sea route to reach Cathay, the land of the Great Khan in China.
Yep, looking for the Mongol court.
Why? Because he had read the wildly popular accounts of Marco Polo detailing the unbelievable wealth, the silk, and the gold of the Pax Mongolica. Columbus was risking his life to reach the Mongol Empire, entirely unaware that the empire had already collapsed and vanished over a century earlier.
If we synthesize this dual legacy, it is deeply uncomfortable to grapple with. The Mongols were an undeniably traumatic, apocalyptic force. They destroyed centuries-old institutions, wiped out irreplaceable libraries, and massacred tens of millions of people. Yet, by violently wiping the slate clean and forcing the East and the West into prolonged, intensive contact, they acted as the violent catalyst for the modern era. The world we live in today was forged in the fires of their conquests.
Which brings us to the end of our journey today. We've covered a staggering amount of ground, from the freezing, bloody steppes of the 12th century to the gates of Vienna, from the horrific sack of Baghdad to the global spread of the Black Death, and even the bureaucratic invention of correction fluid. Thank you for joining us on this extensive deep dive into these incredible sources.
It is a history that completely defies easy categorization, which is exactly why we must continually re-examine the mechanics of how it happened.
And I want to leave you, the learner, with one final lingering concept to mull over on your own. It is the ultimate paradox of this entire epic story. When you look at other massive empires, the Romans, the British, the Spanish, they forced their language, their religion, and their architecture onto the people they conquered. They demanded the world look like them.
Right. Total cultural domination.
But the Mongols didn't. They instituted religious freedom, they utilized local languages, they adopted local customs to govern efficiently. The conquerors ultimately assimilated into the conquered. The Ilkhans in the Middle East became devout Persian Muslims. The Yuan emperors in the East became refined Chinese Buddhists. The greatest paradox of the Mongol Empire is that they built the largest contiguous state in human history, only to voluntarily disappear into the very civilizations they had brought to their knees.